Hello, and welcome to Learning from Nature, the Biomimicry podcast with me, your host, Lily Urmann. In this episode, we dive into a very relevant topic that often is not immediately associated with biomimicry, trade networks and resource sharing. The topics we chat about today are really crucial to building a more life-friendly future, and this is a wonderful showcase of nature-inspired design at a systems level. Our guest, Rana Hajirasouli, will share her experience in the realm of the circular economy, industry collaboration, reducing waste while providing profit, and what the pathways forward look like. Rana is a part-time PhD researcher at the Industrial Resilience Research Group. Her work focuses on the intersection of industrial metabolism, resource sovereignty, and digitization for the diffusion of industrial symbiosis in increasingly complex geopolitical and economic environments. With over 13 years of experience spanning marine conservation, litigation, and chemicals manufacturing, Rana founded the region's leading climate technology startup, The Surplus, in 2021. Now, a Future 100 company from the Ministry of Economy UAE and B Corp certified, The Surplus connects businesses to trade surplus industrial assets and materials, operating across 3 continents and recognized as a 2 times top innovator by the World Economic Forum. Rana holds a U.S. patent for developing new systems for circular economy standardization and resource sharing. Rana has received a Master's of Studies in Sustainability Leadership from the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership with distinction, where she developed an interest in creating diagnostic frameworks for more resilient, localized supply chains in resource-intensive sectors. She has also completed an LLM in International Law from Middlesex University, a Master's in Philosophy and International Peace Studies specializing in the legality of transboundary resource management, and a BA in Philosophy, Political Science, Economics, and Sociology from Trinity College, Dublin. Rana is an accredited GRI Sustainability Professional, Sustainability Excellence Associate, and Learn Biomimicry Practitioner certified. Let's start exploring the possibilities together. Let's hop right in. I'm super excited to chat with you. I'd love for you to just start off with a brief introduction, kind of what you're working on right now.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Lily. My name is Rana Hajirasouli. I'm the founder of a climate/deep tech startup called The Surplus, which helps to map out excess resources within industrial and business ecosystems and trade them. I'm also a PhD researcher at Cambridge University, and my research really focuses on the very same intersection.
So interesting. I would love for you to dive into this challenge of what does it mean to have a surplus? What does it look like in the global supply chain? I know it's a big question, but yeah, what kind of inspired you to create The Surplus and what's the idea behind it?
Honestly, The Surplus kind of came from a little bit of a personal journey. A few years ago, I lost my dad to cardiac arrest. And that was...
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, thank you so much. It was definitely a challenging time. But during that period, I kind of came across some pieces of information that I was quite shocked about. When he went into cardiac arrest, there was a defibrillator component shortage. And I only found out through some of the paramedics that they didn't have visibility over some of the excess stock that was available just a couple of blocks away. That, some of that stock included excess defibrillators. So I really got thinking about the problem of surplus. What does that actually mean for organizations, for the healthcare system? And I realized that surplus can, really be a lifeline if it's not seen as a leftover. So zooming out, the problem is actually quite enormous. Every year, about $1.8 trillion worth of excess inventory and surplus resources just sit unused in our supply chain. So you can imagine the magnitude of that. If we were going to, look at it as an economy, it would be actually the world's 13th largest economy if we were going to put all the stuff that we don't use into a country.
Wow.
So yeah, the magnitude of the problem is actually quite big.
That's massive. And I'm curious if there was an inspired by nature moment behind this, or if that kind of happened separately with Learn Biomimicry, because I know that you did a program with them. What has been the biomimicry inspiration and journey for you?
Honestly, it was a really random journey. I found Learn Biomimicry online during COVID. I really wanted to kind of upskill myself. I'd heard about it and I took an interest. I found Learn Biomimicry. And I started taking some of their, online courses. And then I said, I'd love to do the, practitioner program. I've got a little bit of spare time now. And I got introduced to biomimicry. And Claire Janish was actually my mentor, before she passed away. And I was working with these amazing women in South Africa, which had just opened my eyes and, to basically challenge my entire perspective of what it was to kind of observe and unlearn. It was a really foreign concept. But I came to understand that many of us, especially, I suppose professionals working in business or in sustainability, were often rushing for the solutions. The solutions are often, very much around us. It was just a matter of slowing down and really finding the right methodology to be able to kind of work through that. The first thing that really caught my attention was slime mold. I became really fixated on slime mold networks. And that's actually the inspiration of, the foundation of the surplus, actually, how it helped map efficient but really resilient paths to sort of success. I also was really fixated by fungi. For many biomimics, this is kind of like a very common topic, but I really love the concept of like reciprocal exchange and how we can apply this on sort of different levels. So what really sort of caught my attention was, I'd say, the opportunity that I found to be able to apply these biomimetic principles into a design of a digital platform. And then, emerged, up came the concepts of like adaptive memory without neurons. We know slime molds don't have a brain, but they somehow decided to, remember previous pathways through chemical gradients and oscillatory signals. And I found it so cool. And I was like, what if we could create a platform that was, in theory, inspired by this sort of distributed memory and remembers how, let's say surplus is exchanged through networks, and we can reinforce those pathways and allow these sort of decentralized systems to sort of emerge. And then really the surplus was born. So I quit my old job, and biomimicry was really the foundation that gave me the courage to kind of, pursue this as a full-time thing.
That's incredible. And the background behind it, like nature has been doing this for so long. And so many of our systems, there are these massive pieces that are either missing or not connected. And yeah, I'd love to maybe speak to the element of the surplus where a lot of these ecosystem level or even organism level functionality questions of like how to exchange nutrients, how to better use waste products, how to make sure nothing is wasted in a system really is important right now because our systems are really broken. So I'm curious if you can speak to like how a model like the surplus increases sustainability or lowers waste or connects things that previously weren't connected. Like what does that look like in reality?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what's really interesting is that we often talk about the circular economy or the idea that, waste doesn't exist in nature, but I'm sure that you found actually, in fact, waste, does exist in nature. It's just we have the sort of biological and metabolic frameworks to be able to observe that, nature deals with them in a fundamentally different way. But the way that we've constructed our supply chains is that they're inherently wasteful. So I think there's also a bit of a philosophical approach here to say that the way that we think about waste is normally stuff that kind of goes to landfill. It's junk, they're things that don't necessarily have value. So the way that we kind of envision waste at the surplus is that we really see it in sort of like four categories if we were going to kind of put them into buckets. And one of them is sure, they're the materials and assets that are wasted, but there's also space. So, can you actually co-share capacity with other companies? And that could look like, a chemicals manufacturer co-sharing some trucking space with a garments trader, because every day there is so much waste that goes, within our logistics arteries that it's not just the stuff that we move around, it's also the space that requires to move this stuff around, and also time as well. I think in our kind of like, obsession with efficiency, we've forgotten that, redundancy is equally as important and, resilience is equally as important as well. And a lot of that resilience can really be embedded with human capital. So that means to say that we found that there's a lot of interesting exchanges between unrelated companies that decide to match for reasons that are symbiotic. And in that sense, you can have two completely different companies in different value chains that would have never worked together before. So think of like a really massive conglomerate and a small startup that really wouldn't have, crossed paths. They're in two different industries, but they might be able to kind of, co-share some knowledge with each other and actually, generate revenue out of it. So we had a real life case study where, a small startup had very specific sort of technical acumen, and this large conglomerate was looking for a very large, consultancy company to fulfill this tender for them. And they realized that, instead of paying tons of money to consultancy companies abroad, there's actually this tiny 2-person startup that has this very specialized knowledge that, that they could offer them. The startup surprisingly gave them that time free of charge, but they ended up actually building a business relationship out of that. So I think that was a really good use case to show that, sometimes the small fish can to kind of groom the larger fish, and they could find some sort of symbiosis there. So really what we're really excited about is bringing together an ecosystem of stakeholders and business actors that would have never normally crossed paths, but have the resources to be able to benefit from each other to increase their resilience. And of course, make money as they're progressing through their sustainability journey too.
Yeah, because just like in nature, often when two different organisms work together, it leads to better survival outcomes.
Exactly.
And this is so different than the like status quo for a lot of business models, right? Of like competition, survival of the fittest. I feel like it's very similar for evolution of that, like we're going to have one thing on a pedestal and everyone else is just fighting it out, which can be part of the reality. But I love that this is like really changing things up and proving that working together and collaborating symbiotically can lead to better outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious if you're able to offer a little bit more of a like sneak peek or behind the scenes look into what those connections look like. Like, how do these companies connect? What is the platform like? My brain is just like, what does this look like?
So we started off our journey as kind of like what you call the circular marketplace. And that circular marketplace approach has been, there's so many amazing companies out there that are doing really great jobs in silos. However, for us to transition to a truly circular ecosystem, we need to bridge those connections. So, you have the likes of like, Vinted and Depop, and they're super well known, I think, in the sort of consumer goods space. And when it comes to sort of, garments and clothing, it's very well established within like a business to consumer market context. But when it comes to business, it gets a little bit more abstract because we started off dealing with industrial companies, manufacturing companies that are often kind of connected to the construction value chain. And then over the years, we started realizing that there's a lot more applications here. So now we have schools working with construction companies, they're doing like site visits. They're, that's excess for them is that like, well, we've got a bunch of really great experts in our organization that can do like, facility tours for schools, and they can make extra income whenever their season is low. These are usually small to medium companies, and they get matched essentially. So our matchmaking sort of algorithm really tried to take that inspiration from slime mold to say that like, what is the shortest path to success? And to also celebrate failures in a sense, to say, okay, well, if the business is behaving a certain way, we can technically kind of like catalog its work and predict its next move, because it's not always about supply and demand. It's not that linear. So, even if a company decides to order, let's say, cardboard boxes every week, business changes. There is a lot of variability and unpredictability rather. So in that sense, we tried to map out the company's behaviors, and we translated that into an algorithm that can match surplus across industries that could essentially help the companies succeed with the highest precision. So that would look at, what's available nearby, what could potentially be of use to them for them to procure, and of course, what they could potentially sell or trade as well. Over the years, however, now we're pivoting into a bit more of an agentic interface. That circular marketplace approach, is still great. However, we found some more efficient ways that, can communicate this information for businesses, especially in such a testing time with a lot of, geopolitical changes. There's a lot of, resource nationalism. Circular economy is becoming a top priority for governments and the private sector. So, there's a lot of discussion around how the circular economy is now very closely linked to national security initiatives. I mean, especially with industrial protectionism and tariffs and all the stuff that's going on in the world. We're finding that there are ways to interact between organizations that's faster, it's more automated, and it takes a bit more of an agentic face. So what used to look kind of like a marketplace with a map view now is, transitioning into a bit more of a hyper personalized and customized interaction that relies a lot more on, distributed networks more so than before. So we're just kind of evolving, although the problem set that we're solving is the same. It just means that now our clusters are getting bigger. So, for example, we have a collaboration with Maybank, which is an SME bank in Southeast Asia. They have over 800,000 small to medium customers. They want them to transition to sustainability, to circular economy more specifically. And so this looks like, a bunch of companies sort of lighting up on the map that are trading and collaborating with each other with this sort of methodological framework of how can we categorize everything that we have into 4 pillars. And as I said earlier, that's kind of like space, that's knowledge, that's waste, and that's byproducts. So everything, we understand as waste can be categorized into those, and ultimately makes it easier for companies to have successful matches.
This is amazing. And so much of it is so far over my head. But in a way that like it's important, really important stuff that I feel like a lot of your everyday consumers don't really think about when they're buying products or, getting materials. Are you excited about the potential of biomimicry and want to begin your own journey in this field? Take the short course set from Learn Biomimicry and kickstart a nature-inspired future. Use my code LearningFromNature, that's all one word with no spaces, to save $60 when you purchase the Biomimicry short course set. Just head over to learnbiomimicry.com/learningfromnature. And this is a good segue perhaps into, this, I'm really seeing so many of these circularity principles, life's principles from biomimicry come into play. I'm sure there have been many hurdles along the way. What do some of those challenges look like that you had faced in creating this kind of circular model in the surplus?
That's a great question. Honestly, I think the first challenge is more interlinked. To be honest, it's like a tie between technological hurdles and management hurdles in the sense of organizational psychology. I think that the idea of circular economy in general or applying biomimetic principles goes over many people's heads. They're like, what does biomimicry have to do with me? And I'm sure you find that sometimes people feel it's very niche, but it's actually so broadly applicable. And so many people can use this in real life. So a lot of our work initially had to do with a lot of kind of campaigning and awareness. And especially when it comes to the circular economy, we, again, tend to imagine these closed loops as neat circles. But, in the natural world, loops are, again, very rarely perfect. They're quite leaky and redundant and quite adaptive. I'd say our systems are also very leaky and redundant. They're they're becoming more adaptive. And that's the model that we've, tried to sort of follow. We don't like to force our members to, push every resource into a really rigid circular path. And I feel that in general, that's a mistake that all of us in the sort of circular economy space should learn from, is that, while there are some case studies, we need to be very locally attuned. In each geography, it looks completely different. Like, we're headquartered in Dubai, the UAE, and our, legal and environmental framework being in a desert context looks very different to that of, a company operating in Northern Europe or North America or Southeast Asia. So I think, the challenges around that is that there are legal hurdles, there's technology adoption rates that are very asymmetrical. So, smaller companies are not used to using platforms like this. They're also not used to, I suppose, adopting circular business models in that sense. But believe it or not, the small companies are the most innovative ones because they're so agile and they're constantly focused on survival as well. So I think, to keep it short, the challenge has been cultural as much as technical. Businesses often, when they transition to circular business models, expect a straight line, okay, waste goes here, product goes out there. But in practice, these practices behave a lot more like a web than kind of a wheel, if that makes any sense. So I think a lot of our challenges has sort of been to build the right digital infrastructure that can handle that messy, often overlapping loops while still giving companies the clarity they need for reporting and valuation as well on sort of a management reporting framework.
Yeah, wow, this seems like a really good approach. And I think what I'm just processing right now and reflecting on is hopefully the increase of attention and interest from companies. Have you been seeing in the last few years, more companies get on board with this and reach out and want to join and be part of this network? Or is there still a little bit of hesitation and red tape and hoops you have to jump through in order to get folks on board with this idea?
Oh, of course. There's always some hoops we have to hop through. I think, again, it really depends on the partners. Our go-to market has always very strongly been around resilient industrial ecosystems. And what that means in practice is basically partnerships. Those partnerships are really important for us to get a distribution pipeline. So partners for us look like business parks, economic zones, really large conglomerates with strong portfolios. So think of really large companies that have a lot of their, brands or subsidiary companies under them, or even banks that have, a lot of customers that they could service. So it really does depend on the partner. Although in the last year, we've seen a massive uptick for multiple reasons. I think one, regulation is kind of pushing companies to rethink the way that they are producing things, the way they're sourcing, the way they're manufacturing, and how much money they're actually spending doing the work that they need to do. And they're also realizing that, circular business models in general do have a lot of upsides. And some of those upsides are local sourcing can be cheaper. They can be far more robust when you have kind of local suppliers and local off-takers of excess. And more importantly, they shorten lead times and reduce costs and emissions associated with all of the shipping and, trucking costs as well. So it's very practical, but I'd say on like a higher level, we've definitely gotten some interest because as I said, the sort of supply chain security angle is becoming extremely potent. It's becoming a topic of conversation for many spheres of influence, I think, both within government and subnational governments. And on all levels of government, I'd say, and the sort of private sector as well. I think the only place where we do still sort of face a little bit of resistance is the emerging economy context can be a little bit tricky. Now, the mandates and, legal frameworks are there. It's just they don't actually know how to operationalize the circular economy to make it benefit them. So I think the tensions always kind of lied between like, we have circular solutions, we have climate targets. How do we connect those two?
Yeah.
Right. So like in some contexts, like Europe or the US, you might have some industry benchmarks. There's some sort of international best practices. You've got your regional greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions. But, in other contexts, we're very data poor. And in the data poor context, I feel that while the risk appetite may be the same, it's just the ability to sort of execute with confidence, I think, is a little bit lower because it's very scary to tread into new waters. And honestly, we've had some very brave partners that have taken a risk on, pushing this out and they've seen the results for themselves because ultimately we're just the catalyst. I don't see any of the success coming out of, the use of the platform. A surplus thing? Absolutely not. It's a community thing. It's the partners that really make this happen. And it's the ones that have the largest diversity of stakeholders within their ecosystem they want to push this out to that see the best results. And I think that's definitely a bonus in biomimicry, I suppose. We celebrate diversity in that sense, and it's locally attuned in that context too.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm kind of thinking through all the life's principles. Like this is really aligning with so many of the biomimicry deep patterns that, life all across the planet has to do in order to survive. And so it's cool to hear that there's companies like this that are aligning with so many of those principles and getting other companies to align with those principles because, it turns out they work really well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that's a good segue too for this question, which is, do you bring in biomimicry to the conversation? Or is it something that's kind of like, this is part of how we built this and the journey, but at least from my experience, like getting into the topic of biomimicry can be messy and confusing sometimes. So how do you approach that?
That's a great question. And honestly, I feel like, unfortunately, in the beginning, because biomimicry in my context is very novel, it took a little bit of time. However, I'm sure you find the same thing that biomimetic architecture, for example, is super well established, which is really funny because, we always use the examples of like, the Gherkin Tower in London and in architecture in the built environment, it's like, it's very well known. So if you speak to architects and engineers, they actually know about it.
Yeah.
But when we're speaking to different audiences, it was very difficult to get it to resonate. So now we just say, it's nature inspired and this is what biomimicry is. I do try to bring the conversation back to biomimicry as much as possible because I do believe it's like it's a tool, it's a methodology, and it's a broadly applicable science and art, if you will, that should be broadly accessible. Because I really strongly think that most people can actually get something out of it if they just take a minute to just slow down and have a look into it. And often like how it comes up in conversation is that really it's more that adaptation has been really central to my entrepreneurial journey into the surplus from day one. And we just explained that really briefly to say like, look, like in nature, adaptation isn't about like predicting every change, but it's really about building the capacity to respond when conditions shift. And, framing it in that context, I think resonates a lot more with people because they can say, oh, okay, so, this is sort of like your product will constantly evolve. You as an organization have to evolve. You have to, link in some design principles, some systems thinking, align some of your processes to make sure that, you're able to sort of grow. So I guess when you're speaking to partners, investors, customers, they kind of understand it a bit more. And I feel that, that accessibility is really important when we're talking about biomimicry. Because I don't know about you, but sometimes when you bring up the word biomimicry, they're like, biomimic, what? Like, it sounds quite intimidating. Yeah.
Just the eyes glaze over. But then you get into it, give some examples, and people get really excited. And this reminds me, because you were saying about the biomimicry and architecture examples, there's these classic, very tangible, physical, visual, perhaps, examples of biomimicry that are, I use them all the time. I think a lot of educators use them all the time. But I was extra excited to talk to you because I love examples like this that are a little bit more abstract, but still embodying so many of these principles at a really large scale. That's maybe, less of like a physical product, even though there is a product here, but it's like this community building, this network building, this connections and relationships strengthening application of it, which I think is less talked about, but just as important. And we're going to need all of these solutions to create a life-friendly future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's really interesting. You mentioned that. I just remembered as well that like we can also apply these in the way that we conduct our business as well. I mean, like conduct our actual everyday life. So I did an exercise with my team and I was like, guys, like we need to find a biomimetic example of how we can not get burnt out. And they just burst out laughing. And I was like, well, there's not actually that many examples, like the really well-known, well-established sort of biomimicry examples that, make the rounds. And then there's ones that are a little bit more scarce. So I just was really interested to see what can I find in the desert. I've grown up in the desert and there's so many fascinating examples here in terms of resourceful strategies. I was like, well, I'd love to kind of see an archive, like, on this part of the world, like it's really neglected. So I just started, looking into stuff and kind of, zooming in and zooming out. And I found the Arabian oryx and how it kind of like is lazy, but in a very cool way. And it uses low energy processes and it kind of like manipulates its physiology and behavior at different times of the year to increase its survival during times when like food and water are limited in supply. So in the summer, this cute little creature, when droughts are really common in the desert, obviously, it drastically like reduces its like minimal fasting metabolic rate by just kind of like lying completely inactive, like lazing around beneath the shade and trees during the day and then kind of ranging over smaller areas at night to forage. And so like it lets its, body temperature, rise during the heat of the day. And then it uses its kind of like less evaporative cooling and retains more body water at night. So I found that super cool. And like we zoomed in on that. We saw that, there was all this cool stuff about its network of like small arteries and those like branches near the two cardioid arteries and stuff near the brain and all this very cool stuff to basically demonstrate how efficient these animals are at like surviving in times where resources are so scarce. And I was like, well, guys, we're all low in energy right now. We're low in cash. So let's take some inspiration from the Arabian oryx. Mm-hmm. And so we did. And so we took out some of those principles and it actually worked really well. Now, we didn't laze around under the shade in the desert, obviously, but we applied those like a bit more practically. Yeah. And I found it was really wonderful because, my team started getting interested in biomimicry and they're like, hey, we found this really cool thing on the desert ant and we found this other thing on like the oriental hornet. So the team was getting really engaged in this and they found,
I love that.
Yeah, like very cool ways to be able to apply this to some of the bottlenecks that they were facing. And instead of saying like, oh, how do we fix this? It was, okay, like, well, what do we ask nature? How does nature do X, Y, and Z? So I felt really, really proud of that moment. And more importantly, bringing a bit of light to, some of the principles we can learn from our own context, which has been like historically quite neglected as well in the Middle East.
Yeah, this idea of seasonality, I feel like is just so important for every aspect because nature does that really well for most of the organisms. And like, how do we embody that in a way that makes sense for us, in the current systems that maybe don't allow for that all the time, but are there ways we can weave it in? I love that.
Yeah, exactly.
You spoke to this a little earlier, but I'm wondering, like, Surplus has this global reach. What does it look like when you're working to balance this, like, natural principles and circularity models with maybe like cultural specificities or different communities that you're working with?
Honestly, I think we always go back to being as locally attuned as possible. This is something that's incredibly important. Again, this was definitely some learnings, I took away from learning about biomimicry, learning from nature and about nature and all of the above. And that there is this sort of universal principle that manifests differently in different environments. And that holds true in a business context as well. If we step back, we know, okay, photosynthesis is like a universal process, but like cacti and rainforest trees would express it completely differently depending on the context. And so we, actively kind of put this into practice, at the company as well, that the underlying logic is that resource loops or the way that companies might engage in certain types of relationships and ensuring we have the right threshold of diversity to create these sort of adaptive networks is also critically important as well. So like even the way that we communicate, so just putting that into very basic tech context is that we know that, we're building this very cool machine learning algorithm that needs to be distributed. But we know, for example, in Southeast Asia, WhatsApp is like a really great way to communicate, and they prefer not to go onto different channels. And there's QR codes for everything. So of course, in terms of communication, we had to adapt it to the local context. We also, of course, take a bit more of like an informed approach to our new geographies as well. So we make sure like any of the artificial intelligence is trained on local data as well, because that's like really important. We also, I'm sure you've heard about all of the sort of biases that are getting flagged in AI systems at the moment. And we wanted to make sure we're very aware of that, and that we're also, ensuring that we're basically processing data very responsibly and giving recommendations equally as responsibly through our sort of, intelligent systems as well. Because in a sense, they kind of are living, breathing things now. They're kind of talking back to you. It's a little bit surreal, but as a tech company, it's really important that we remain basically as locally attuned as possible, that we can be globally coherent, I guess, in the way that we're solving the problem, but also locally legitimate, which is, very important.
Yeah, that's a lovely statement. I feel like it captures so much. And I have, so many questions and concerns with the direction of AI and machine learning, but at the same time, it is a really powerful tool. And if we can figure out how to use it for good and train it in a way that's less biased and less rooted in systems of oppression, that's the way to go for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Are there personal rituals you have or nature connection moments you have that fuel your creativity and the way that you lead the surplus and just life in general?
Honestly, I wish I can give you like, a positive and refreshing answer. But being in a startup, you could work 14, 15 hours a day and you barely have time to it's like screen time, meetings, emails. I really do wish I had some more time to do that. But honestly, one thing that really did move me a lot and I became very connected to it was Nichiren Buddhism. So I went to Japan for a work trip and I went to this beautiful temple stay that was like nested in a Japanese prefecture, like very remote in the mountains. And I sort of learned the art of chanting. And for, chatty individuals like myself who cannot have a moment of silence in my head, I found that was a really, really wonderful way to kind of connect with your surroundings, ground yourself, and really kind of step back and be able to kind of zoom in and out. I feel it's really important to be able to kind of focus when needed, but also step back and see the big picture. And that's been like a challenge for me as an entrepreneur. And that's definitely been absolutely wonderful. And that's, Nichiren Buddhism principles are very deeply rooted in nature and environmental conservation. So that also aligns a lot with my values. And it was amazing. Yeah, I'd highly recommend it.
Yeah, I got to try that out. I'm also an individual that has thoughts and is talking all the time and my head's always busy. So meditation and journaling and just getting outside, even if it's, little sections of time, I think is really important. And I only have a couple more questions, but I'm wondering what you see as the future of surplus and where you see as like moments of, I don't know if hope is the right word, but the direction you see this going and the impact that you see it making. Like, what's the grand vision?
I think the grand vision, to be honest, is that for us, scaling isn't always about making things bigger. And I think a lot of tech companies get stuck in this trap, which bigger is not always better. For us, it's about maintaining function across all levels. So for us, being able to create those meaningful industrial connections, that visibility over resources that are becoming so critical, I think has to be taken with a pinch of salt. So I think the practical answer for that would be deep market penetration. We also want to be seen as a responsible B Corp company that takes impact really very seriously. We're locally, we're kind of known for a lot of our work, around circular giving, engaging with sort of social impact projects. But in order to do that, I think we need to scale, but scale more responsibly. So it's not just about how many transactions have we multiplied? We really want to be able to replicate the patterns. So on a big picture, I think, where I would love to see us is kind of like one of the global operating systems for the circular economy that's trusted, that's responsible, and that's always there for small to medium businesses. And the kind of pattern that I would really love to see, and this is being hopeful, is replicating this clustered approach that we have. So you can pick out on a map and say, oh, look at, this cluster. We're able to see all of its characteristics. There's, 5 or 10,000 companies. And this is kind of what's going on here. These are the most traded materials. This is, the sharing practices that are the most common there. And this is, some of the most lucrative economic patterns we're seeing. And on the other side of the world, here's its sister cluster that's kind of doing something similar. And these two clusters have actually reinforced and learned from each other. That replicability is really something I'm passionate about seeing. And that's some of the stuff that I'm doing in my research as well. I'm looking at these sort of fractal principles where you kind of like zoom, like, you know, the way that you kind of zoom into snowflakes and then you zoom out and they've got like these kind of like repetitive patterns. Those are the kind of, I suppose, outcomes I would really like to see. And most importantly, just, you know, being known as like a company that's making genuine social and economic impact for small businesses at such a testing time.
Yeah. I mean, if we can even get a little bit closer to that goal, I think there would be so much change and impact that could happen. You spoke to this a little bit, but I'm curious if we can expand on it maybe a little bit more. Like, you know, natural systems, ecosystems around the world, they work really well at local scales. You mentioned a lot of this like locally attuned principles. What have you learned in the process of scaling surplus through these nature-inspired solutions, or what does that look like? And how has it gotten to where it is today, I guess might be a better question.
The short answer is collaboration.
Yay.
I know. Honestly, I know it's a very generic statement, but genuinely it is collaboration.
I love that.
And I think we were kind of like able to start having a bit more of like an international footprint because we collaborated with academic institutions. We collaborated with economic zones to help them, you know, reach their own goals, making their problem ours. So again, there's a lot of symbiosis here. And industrial symbiosis is really what we're trying to accomplish anyway, this kind of like ecosystem of companies that are able to benefit from each other and you know, build in this sort of like localized resilience. So we couldn't do that without having partners. So we had logistics partners, we had, you know, commercial partners, we've had technical partners. And that sort of collaboration for us is that, like, you know, we don't just want to close just very superficial partnerships. It's rather having deep, meaningful collaborations where, you know, we do see longevity there and there's opportunity to kind of grow and expand, and that naturally we'll be able to embed that sort of network effect there as well. So yeah, I would say, you know, those collaborations have helped us sort of see these patterns, which is that, you know, you need density to transition to circular economy. You need to also have enough diversity in these business parks or business clusters to be able to actually benefit, because homogeneity, funny enough, or homogenous sort of zones don't actually have the same level of benefit as these heterogeneous zones do, which is really interesting. Is that, again, we're celebrating diversity and resilience, and in that sense we can, you know, really build in some of these feedback loops as well. So I think there's a lot of learnings there for supply chain networks, and, you know, and why it's so incredibly important that, you know, we cannot accomplish anything in silos. So, you know, even if it's potentially companies that you thought you would never work with in a million years, we've got the case studies to show that actually the best trades, the most, you know, lucrative trades economically and most environmentally efficient trades are normally with actors that would have never worked with each other before.
That's super interesting. How would a company get involved or learn more about this?
On our website, we do have just kind of like a really short form. The team usually gets back to them, but now we have an automated onboarding as well. So yeah, it just takes about 15 minutes basically to get on board, learn the methodology, and get matching. We also do have multiple options for companies to join clusters for a preferential rate. Of course, we do have, you know, a lot of freebies as well for social impact organizations, NGOs. They all go for free. So we do have, of course, a tiered system that makes it financially reasonable. And most importantly, I think I forgot to mention this, the system actually pays you back for engaging in symbiotic relationships. So the ROI is usually 3 to 5 weeks, if I remember correctly. So companies will make their money back, and everything thereafter through all of their trades, they save their money, they keep that in their pocket, and all the extra revenue is for them to keep and stay happy, basically.
That's awesome. And Rana, what are you really looking forward to right now, or what are you working on that's giving you joy, that you're really excited about?
My kind of like quiet time is working on my PhD research. I'm really, really passionate about the intersection of what I'm working on, which is really related to some of the work at Surplus. But I'm actually kind of like working on building this, I suppose, new sort of system that takes, you know, security principles from intelligence and plugs them into a new potential framework to be able to observe industrial ecosystems, taking nature's principles, of course, better understand them, and actually understand their performance through various interjections. So in practice, that means like, how do we build better industrial ecosystems? What are the precedents for that? And how can we get it right from the very start?
A big question.
It's a big question, yeah.
And are you like at a good point with that, or are you just starting out? Like what level, what stage are you at with that research?
So I've just finished my probationary phase. I'm going into my second year of my PhD. And so I'm doing the field work at the moment, which is really exciting. I get to talk to some really interesting actors all over the world that are working in critical minerals, that are working in rare earth elements, to all of the stuff that we really need for the next transition away from fossil fuels and, into urban mining, because we're going to need to, use a lot of this stuff to make the next generation of EVs and computers. And as you know, chips are very high in demand with all of this, the increased use of AI, and we're going to need data centers for that. So I'm really interested to figure out how do we build better ecosystems that can absorb it, valorize it, aggregate it, not waste this stuff, and make sure that, we're also, bearing in mind that we have, we need to use these resources far more responsibly and locate them as well. So visibility is a very big element of that. And that's actually the part that I'm most excited about, is bringing full visibility to that value chain and finding out what the points of interjection are for being able to valorize them at different points of the supply chain. So hopefully much less goes to waste.
Wow. Yeah, I'm looking forward to following along on that research and kind of seeing what comes out of that, because it's something I think about frequently, as well as I'm sure many people who care about the environment and ethical questions are, concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think more and more we're starting to see that there is a huge demand for visibility. The great thing about, open data is that it's open, it's public, anybody can access it. I think it's just we need better interfaces that can make it easier for people to see, what's actually going on in their supply chain, because their hard-earned money is going towards buying products. And, it's their full right to be able to see what goes behind that product, how many hands have touched it, where has it actually gone? Because our globalized, supply chain system is so incredibly convoluted that, even the best of the best experts still barely understand the magnitude of how fast things move and where they move from. So, it's an exciting puzzle piece. And there's many people that are working super hard to be able to chip away at this. And it's just great to be able to observe this on the sidelines and hopefully get a little bit wiser as well in the next kind of couple of years on this.
I love that. It's been so fun chatting with you. I feel like I've learned so much, and I have so many more questions that I'm excited to look into online and do some more research into surplus. But yeah, this has been really lovely. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. Honestly, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in. This is a quick reminder that we have some really awesome nature nerd merch like shirts and stickers, so you can help support the podcast and look cool on your next hike. These were custom designed by my friend and incredible artist, Sarah Williams, and they showcase the amazing range of unique organisms here on Earth. You can grab yours at learningfromnature.earth/merch. I also want you all to know how much I appreciate every review, rating, recommendation, and support, as you are all helping biomimicry reach more people. Together, we can not only imagine, but create a beautiful world with life at the forefront and guiding the way. This episode was brought to you by Learn Biomimicry. If you're wanting to start your own biomimicry journey, they have a special offer for my listeners. I've known about Learn Biomimicry for ages and actually was a mentor for one of their programs briefly a few years ago. I've seen firsthand the impact it can have on folks. This is your chance to better understand biomimicry in just 3 short courses, all with the depth of a degree and the ease of a TED Talk. Today, Learn Biomimicry has helped more than 1,679 learners from over 41 countries practice biomimicry in their personal and professional lives. They've brought biomimicry to every continent, with the exception of Antarctica, although that could change, you never know. All my listeners save $60 when you purchase the Biomimicry short course set. There's also a free ebook to get you started. Use the coupon code LEARNINGFROMNATURE with no spaces, or head to www.learnbiomimicry.com/learningfromnature. That's all one word. www.learnbiomimicry.com/learningfromnature. Happy learning.